keeps looking at me. And, kids change a lot between 12 and 15 anyway. And so incarcerated kids change a lot more than that. So I didn't recognize him at first. But about halfway through the sermon, I recognized that I was face to face for the first time in 3 years with the kid that killed my son. The day, and the kid lost the fight, comes back with a gun, shoots my son. And so 1:30 in the morning on August 27th, I'm standing in the DC morgue, identifying, my son's body. And they had brought us into the room, wheeled him up to the glass, opened the bag. He still had this shocked look on his face. They hadn't even closed his period of incarceration. Did 3.5 years on federal drug charges. And on August 26, 1995, he had gotten into a fight with a 12-year-old named Dante earlier in the day, basically over a corner. I fully admit that my son was, selling drugs, and I hadn't been able to really get a handle on that. I'd only been home a few months. And so they got into a fight earlier in the day, and the kid lost the fight, comes back with a gun, shoots my son. Even talking about the healing of it, and not necessarily because I'm still in a whole lot of pain, although there's still some there. I'm not going to deny and say that, I'm completely all the way there. But it is part of what was keeping me sort of bound up and angry was that I hadn't forgiven. One thing I've learned about forgiveness is that sometimes it has more to do with me than it does with the other person. That I'm the one bound up and sort of trapped. You technically, whether you have this idea that you deserve it or not, or whether or not you're actually sorry for what you did or not, I'm not bound up anymore. So it's just easier to kind of let go of some stuff than it is to kind of walk around with that anger and that pain and I'm not telling anybody else that they should or they shouldn't. What everybody's healing process is, being, the parent of or a family member of a homicide victim, is everybody else's process. I'm not trying to dictate that to anybody else. Not quite where I am with this. So, as a result, this is kind of contentious, and I would say it's a little contentious between us too. That she's not quite, and I respect that too. I respect the fact that she's not as that forgiveness for her has taken a little longer, and her process has been a little different. She carried him for 9 months. I didn't. So I respect the fact that she's not quite where I'm at. To dealing with my anger at Dante. But none of that was helping me. Walking around with all of that stuff was sort of like just walking around with a pressure cooker, constantly like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And the more I was holding on to it, the angrier I was getting. And letting it go for me was probably, I would say it's probably the best thing that I ever did. Just for my own self. Yes, it had a great effect on Dante, and yes, it was the start of a healing process for both of us. But just selfishly, it meant that the pillow talked to me, and so I felt this kind of urging to actually. And as a result of that forgiveness process, he's a very different man today. He is, so now 24 years later, obviously he's been out since he was 21. He's doing some anti-violence work in Los Angeles. He's a deacon in his church. He's, married, has his own family, and tells me all the time that as a result of our relationship and my willingness to forgive, that he is not the kid that went in that, obviously, and his life obviously is different. people engage in violence. It isn't just because they're animals. It isn't just because they're, they're inherently violent. A lot of times it has to do with poverty and lack of opportunity. And so, and how people are treated in the justice system also has to do with that. It has to do with that too. So you have to kind of address both things. That's what restorative justice does. It gives the opportunity first for the person who was on the receiving end of the crime, or the family on the receiving end if the victim is no longer there, and then the person that that actually engaged in that, it gives them a chance to try to repair it if both sides are willing. First off, because that was one thing I think that was unique about it. Both sides have to be willing. First and foremost, both sides have to be willing, and there should be a process for that. Second, you've also got to address all the symptomatic stuff. Like I said, I'm grateful now that he was kept in the juvenile system, that he was seen as a child who had, yes, he had committed a crime, but this was a 12-year-old. This wasn't an adult. Not that, and then I'm painfully aware that if it had been the other side, then it would have been my son. He would have been charged as an adult because he was 14. But 14 isn't any older than 12, really. So I think you have to look at the system and say, okay, is this punishment system working? Is it making people any better? What is it? 95% of inmates are going to come home at some point. People who are currently incarcerated people are going to come home at some point. Is this current system making them any better or more prepared to come back into society? And I think those are one of the biggest things that we have to address. Then all you're going to have is somebody who's coming out probably more hardened, more traumatized, and coming back to a community that they're not prepared for. Prepared when they come out, because you go in and you do 25, 30 years and you come out, life has changed dramatically in that amount of time period. And it seems like the more we go along, the more it changes more and more rapidly. Come on, smartphones have only been out 10 years, and think about how much our lives now, and if you've only been inside 10 years and you've never touched one, and now you come out in this, you went in with still flip phones, you come out and now it's a smartphone. How much is that, and how much of our lives now depend on this little device? Emotional, even though it's been, I don't know, probably a little over 20 years since the day that I forgave him, and it's definitely been longer than that since my son died. But it's still really hard to talk about without getting emotional. Even talking about the healing of it, and not necessarily because I'm still in a whole lot of pain, although there's still some there. I'm not going to deny and say that I'm completely all the way there, but it is to actually be in a situation where you have to really forgive and let go, and that you want to see somebody else's life heal too, and not, because a lot of people are like, oh, well, that all sounds good until you've lived it. A lot of people who are, I've heard this from other people who are probably not where I'm at, have said, well, that sounds good. In fact, I just had this big argument with somebody on Facebook a couple of weeks ago. Oh, well, that all sounds good until you actually live it. I'm like, yeah, but I have. son,